What happens when 120 families buy their dream homes only to find out the land beneath them was never for sale? In Texas, one HOA president's arrogance built a neighborhood on lies, and one man's patience turned the entire project into a ticking time bomb. Janice Mand wasn't the kind of person who settled for small victories. She wanted her name tied to something big. Something people in Briar Glen, just outside Dallas, would remember for decades. So when the chance came to push through a housing development, unlike anything their HOA had ever seen, she grabbed it with both hands. 20 modern homes, sleek townhouses with granite countertops, polished wood floors, and energy-efficient windows were going to rise on what she called the community's forgotten acreage. To Janice, it was her ticket to prestige, to recognition, and maybe even a spot in regional politics later down the line. But here's the twist. What she called community land wasn't community land at all. And her mistake was about to become one of the biggest legal scandals the town had ever seen. People in Briar Glen already knew Janice as a sharp-tongued leader who didn't tolerate resistance. At HOA meetings, she ran the table like it was her personal courtroom. She'd glare at anyone who dared challenge her, flipping through her stack of bylaws and quoting them like scripture. "We're not just managing lawns and fences here," she once snapped at a neighbor during a meeting. "We're protecting property values, lifestyles, and legacies." That was Janice's philosophy, legacy. And in her mind, that stretch of land behind Briar Glen's main entrance, a wide expanse of sunburnt Texas soil dotted with mesquite trees, was wasted potential. Developers from Fort Worth had been pressing her for months, dangling glossy brochures, spreadsheets of projected profits, and promises of political connections. Finally, after weeks of private dinners and closed-door meetings, Janice signed the agreement. The HOA board was split on the decision, but Janice's voice carried more weight than anyone else's. She sold the idea with confidence, declaring, "This isn't just about houses, it's about the future of Briar Glen." Construction began almost overnight. Bulldozers flattened the land, dust clouds rising into the summer air as workers hammered stakes into the ground. Families driving by on their way to work in Dallas marveled at the speed of progress. The development was called The Gables at Briar Glen, and signs advertising affordable luxury starting in the low 300s popped up all along Highway 287. For young couples and retirees alike, it sounded like a dream. Brand new homes in a growing suburb, managed by a strong HOA that promised stability and order. Janice walked through the construction site daily in her tailored blazer and designer sunglasses, shaking hands with contractors as if she were the mayor. "This is what progress looks like," she told a small group of prospective buyers during a tour. One of them, a teacher named Paula, asked, "Are you sure everything's cleared? I've heard rumors the land's been privately owned for years." Janice laughed, her voice sharp and dismissive. "Rumors are cheap, paperwork is what matters. And trust me, we've got it handled." But that wasn't true, because not far from where Janice was giving her speech, a man named Calvin Redden stood on the edge of the construction zone, leaning against his old Chevy truck. Calvin wasn't dressed like a lawyer or a businessman. He wore faded jeans, a short-sleeve button-up, and work boots worn thin from years of use. His calm expression didn't reveal the storm brewing inside him. That land, every inch of it, belonged to his family. His grandfather had purchased it in 1953, back when black landowners were often pushed off their property through intimidation or shady legal tricks. But the rains had held on to it, passing down the deed like a sacred text. Calvin kept the original documents locked away in a fireproof safe in his living room. So when he saw bulldozers plowing through mesquite trees, he didn't yell, he didn't protest with signs, he didn't call the local news. Instead, he did something Janice never expected. He waited. Calvin knew the law. He had spoken with lawyers, consulted with real estate experts, and studied cases where developers built without checking the right paperwork. The mistake wasn't his, it was theirs. And every nail hammered into those new homes only deepened the trap Janice had walked straight into. Meanwhile, in the polished conference rooms where Janice met with investors, the mood was electric. Money was moving, contracts were closing, and buyers were putting down deposits. She strutted out of meetings like a victor, convinced she had pulled off the biggest coup of her career. What Janice didn't know was that while she was celebrating, Calvin was documenting everything. Dates, times, permits, photos of construction, every piece of evidence was quietly stacking up in his favor. And the more homes that rose, the heavier the fall would be when the truth finally came crashing down. But while Calvin prepared in silence, Janice's empire was just beginning to take shape. And the higher she climbed, the harder she was about to fall. Calvin Redden wasn't the kind of man most people noticed right away. He was quiet, deliberate, and the kind of neighbor who waved when you passed, but didn't insert himself into every conversation. People at the Briar Glen gas station knew him by sight, usually filling up his old truck with a coffee in hand. He was steady, the kind of presence you barely thought about until something forced you to. But behind that easy presence was a history that shaped everything he did. Calvin's grandfather, Theodore Redden, had bought the land in 1953, right after returning from serving in the Korean War. Land in Texas was tough to hold on to back then, especially for a black family in a town where property lines often shifted depending on who had influence at City Hall. Theodore refused to be pushed around. He saved every receipt, filed every tax document, and kept copies of every map that proved the Reddens' ownership of that soil. His mantra was simple: paper speaks louder than words. That philosophy ran deep in the family. When Theodore died, the deed went to Calvin's father, Lawrence. Lawrence built a modest home on the edge of the acreage, but never developed it. He'd tell Calvin as a boy, "This land is your insurance. Whatever storms life brings, this ground will keep you standing." Those words etched themselves in Calvin's memory. By the time the bulldozers showed up in 2021, Calvin had already inherited the deed, carefully sealed in plastic sleeves inside a fireproof safe. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't have to. He knew that piece of paper gave him power, stronger than any board meeting or slick-talking investor. One afternoon, while construction crews were staking the ground, Calvin's cousin Jerome drove by and pulled into the dirt shoulder. "You going to let him keep going like this?" Jerome asked, shaking his head as he looked at the machinery chewing into the earth. Calvin leaned on the hood of his truck, calm as always. "They're not building on sand, Jerome. They're building on my deed. Every dollar they sink into this place just makes the case stronger." Jerome frowned. "Man, they're putting up houses like it's nothing. You don't feel the need to stop it now?" Calvin took a slow sip of water from his bottle before answering. "Why would I? Let him dig their own grave. When the time comes, I'll show the judge the papers." Simple as that. That patience set Calvin apart. Most people would have run straight to court or called the sheriff to block construction, but Calvin understood leverage. The more they built, the more families moved in, the more money exchanged hands, the harder the fall would be. He wasn't after revenge, he was after his family's name, his grandfather's work, his father's words. None of it was going to be erased by an HOA president chasing clout. Meanwhile, Janice was still riding high. In HOA newsletters, she plastered photos of herself in a hard hat, smiling with developers under the caption, "Briar Glen, building for tomorrow." Local papers covered the groundbreaking, quoting Janice's line, "This project will redefine what suburban living means in North Texas." Calvin clipped every article. He wasn't sentimental about it. He just understood evidence. At home, his wife Denise worried about the pressure building. "Cal, what if they sell all those houses before anyone realizes the land isn't there?" she asked one evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the last light fade behind the half-built roofs. "They will sell them," Calvin said quietly, "and every buyer will be part of my case. The HOA thinks they own the ground. The buyers think they bought into security, but the deed says otherwise." He paused and looked at Denise. "It's not just about the land, it's about proving our name means something." Denise reached over, resting her hand on his. "Your granddad would be proud." Calvin gave a faint smile. "He'll be proud when I win." By autumn, rows of identical houses lined the once empty field. Families toured the model homes. Children ran across unfinished sidewalks, and realtors pitched the neighborhood as the next great investment. Buyers were reassured by Janice's confidence. "This land was vetted by the HOA," she told one couple during an open house. "We've left no stone unturned." But Calvin had the stone, and it was heavy enough to crush the entire project. But while Janice's name was splashed across headlines, Calvin's name was still quiet, waiting for the right moment to thunder into the story. The gables at Briar Glen didn't just rise, it exploded into existence. From the moment construction crews broke ground, it was a frenzy of progress. Trucks rumbled through the narrow roads of Briar Glen, hauling in steel beams and concrete, while workers swarmed the lots with hard hats and tool belts. Neighbors who had lived there for decades couldn't believe how fast it was happening. Within weeks, what used to be open land covered in dust and scattered mess trees was transforming into a neighborhood of grid lines, foundations and skeleton frames. To the families already living in Briar Glen, it was a mix of awe and irritation. Some admired the vision. "Finally, our property values are going to skyrocket," one resident, Patricia Karn, said at the local coffee shop. Others muttered about the noise, the traffic and the arrogance of Janice Mand. But Janice didn't flinch. She was out there almost every day, striding across the construction site in heels far better suited for boardrooms than dirt lots, pointing out details, waving at developers, and carrying herself like a politician on the campaign trail. Investors loved it. Buyers lined. Realtors boasted about the HOA's forward-thinking leadership, and Janice soaked it in like sunlight. At one site visit, she stopped a foreman in front of a nearly finished model home. "This is the crown jewel," she said, running her manicured hand along the door frame. "When families see this, they'll know Briar Glen isn't just a place to live. It's a statement." The foreman nodded, more focused on his clipboard than her speech. "We're ahead of schedule. Should be ready for open houses in 2. Perfect," Janice replied, smiling for the photographer she'd hired to document her leadership in action. But while Janice was building her public image, the buyers were building dreams. Young couples from nearby Fort Worth came to walk the lots, imagining barbecues in the backyards and holiday lights on the porches. Retirees drove down from Oklahoma, excited about settling into a warm community. A single mother named Dana Ortiz, who worked as a nurse at a hospital in Arlington, walked her 2 boys through the framed-out hallways of a house she had already put a deposit on. "This is your room," she told them, her voice bright with hope. The boys' eyes lit up as they ran across the bare plywood floor. It all looked perfect on the surface, but perfection rarely holds when the foundation is cracked. At one HOA meeting held in the Briar Glen Community Center, a few longtime residents started asking sharper questions. A man named Greg Simmons stood up, his folded arms showing his frustration. "Janice, who exactly owns the land those homes are sitting on? I've heard different things. Some folks say it's private. Some say it's community-owned. Which is it?" Janice gave him a thin smile, the kind that barely masked irritation. "Greg, we've already addressed this. The land was reviewed, cleared and secured for development. There's nothing to worry about." Greg pressed further. "Then why hasn't the county updated their property maps yet?" "I checked the records last week. That parcel's still listed under a private owner." A murmur went through the crowd. Janice leaned forward, gripping the microphone. "Mr. Simmons, I suggest you leave legal matters to people qualified to handle them. You want progress? Then trust the leadership making it happen." She ended the discussion there, gave the meeting closed before anyone else could raise a hand. For most, her confidence was enough. But for a few, including Greg, the seed of doubt was planted. Meanwhile, Calvin Redden was still watching. Some evenings he'd park his truck a block away and take photos of the new homes rising. He didn't hide it. He didn't need to. To the workers, he was just another passerby. To Calvin, every picture was another piece of the puzzle. One afternoon, as a realtor walked a young couple around a finished property, Calvin overheard part of the pitch. "You'll love the security of this HOA. Strong leadership, clean paperwork, nothing to worry about." Calvin's lips pressed into a thin line. Later, he sat in his kitchen with Denise, sliding the photo of that realtor across the table. "They're selling a dream built on a lie," he said. Denise sighed. "And the buyers have no clue." "They'll find out," Calvin answered. "When the time's right." Back at the site, the homes rose faster than ever. Streets were paved, stop signs were installed, and decorative stone walls went up with the name The Gables at Briar Glen etched into them. Families started moving in, placing welcome mats outside their doors and hanging curtains in their windows. From the outside, it looked like a thriving new neighborhood, but just under the surface, questions lingered about who really had the right to call that land their. But while families celebrated their fresh starts, the truth about the land's ownership was a storm waiting to break, and Calvin held the lightning in his hands. By the time the first families carried furniture into their new homes, Calvin had already filled 2 binders with documentation. Every photograph was dated. Every copy of a building permit was neatly filed. He even kept a log of conversations he overheard between contractors and HOA representatives. To anyone else it might have looked obsessive, but to Calvin it was simply preparation. He didn't storm meetings. He didn't show up waving papers. That wasn't his way. His grandfather had taught him the value of patience, and Calvin had learned early in life that the loudest man in the room often lost before the fight even started. Quiet was his weapon, and in that quiet, he was building a case too heavy for Janice Mann to lift. On a humid August afternoon, Calvin drove out to the edge of the development. The streets were freshly paved, the smell of asphalt clinging to the air. Children pedaled their bikes across the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing between unfinished homes. He pulled his truck to the side, leaned on the door, and took a slow panoramic video with his phone. His neighbor, an old friend named Troy Hammond, pulled up behind him. Troy was the opposite of Calvin, restless, quick to anger, never able to keep his opinions bottled up. He walked over, shaking his head as he looked at the rows of houses. "Man, this don't sit right," Troy muttered. They're building a whole city on your ground like you don't even exist. Calvin closed the video and slipped his phone into his pocket. They know I exist, he said quietly. Troy frowned. Then why ain't you stopping them? You've got the papers. You've got the proof. If it were me, I'd shut this whole thing down tomorrow. Calvin let the silence stretch before answering. If you swat a mosquito, you kill one bug. But if you let him breed, then when you spray you wipe out the whole nest. I'm waiting for the nest. Troy blinked, then let out a low whistle. You're colder than I thought, Cal. Calvin gave a half smile. Not cold. Careful. Back at home, Denise worried about how long he could keep waiting. She watched him every evening, hunched over the dining table with maps, deeds and folders spread out. Cal, I trust you, she said one night, as she poured him coffee. But these people, they don't play fair. What if they try to bury this before you even get your day in court? Calvin looked up, his eyes steady. They can't bury paper, D. My grandfather taught me that. When the law's on your side, you don't have to shout, you just have to show up. Meanwhile, Janice was thriving in the spotlight. The local newspaper ran another feature, calling her the driving force behind Briar Glen's renewal. She cut ribbons, posed for photos, and gave interviews about the visionary leadership of the HOA. At a Friday evening cocktail reception with investors at a country club in Arlington, Janice bragged openly. We took land nobody wanted and turned it into the jewel of the county. That's leadership. A developer laughed, raising his glass, and it's making all of us rich. Across town that same evening, Calvin was sitting at his kitchen table with his lawyer, Monica Trallian, a sharp, nonsense woman with 30 years of property law behind her. She flipped through the binders Calvin had compiled, nodding slowly. You've got them in a box, Monica said finally, tapping one of the permits. They didn't clear title properly. That's mistake number 1. They started construction without verifying ownership. That's mistake number 2. And every family who bought a home here, they're buying a property that legally doesn't exist. That's mistake number 3. Calvin leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped. So, when do we move? Not yet, Monica replied. The more they build, the bigger the damage is. When you file, you won't just be asking for recognition. You'll be asking for compensation. Millions. Maybe. Calvin gave a single nod. That was exactly what he wanted. Not the money itself, but the acknowledgement that his family's name and their land had been ignored for too long. Meanwhile, the families moving in had no idea. On Saturdays, moving trucks lined the streets. Children bounced basketballs on driveways. Couples planted flowers in front yards. They were building lives on ground that legally wasn't theirs to touch. From his porch, Calvin could see the glow of their porch lights at night. Denise asked him once, "Do you ever feel bad for them? They don't know they're part of all this." Calvin's voice was soft when he answered, "They should have known. They trusted the wrong people, and sooner or later, they're going to realize what it costs to follow someone like Janice." But even as Calvin sharpened his case, whispers were beginning to spread, because not everyone in Briar Glen trusted Janice's story about the land. It started as whispers, conversations held at the edge of cul-de-sacs, over fences, and in the aisles of the Briar Glen grocery store. At first, they were small concerns. A new homeowner mentioned that the county clerk's office still listed the land under an unfamiliar name. Another said they couldn't find the subdivision on the tax rolls. Most brushed it off, assuming paperwork just hadn't caught up. But others, especially longtime residents, began to wonder if Janice Mand had been too quick to celebrate. The first real pushback came during a tense HOA meeting in late September. The community center was packed, every folding chair filled. Families who had just moved into their new homes showed up along with older residents who'd lived in Briar Glen for decades. Greg Simmons, the same man who had questioned Janice weeks earlier, stood up again, this time holding a stack of documents. "I went back down to the Tarrant County Courthouse," he said, his voice firm. "And guess what? The deed to that land behind our subdivision isn't listed under the HOA. It isn't listed under the developers either. It's listed under a man named Calvin Redden." A ripple moved through the room. Some turned to each other, whispering the name. Others looked directly at Janice, waiting for her response. Janice adjusted her glasses, her jaw tight. "Greg, I've told you before, the land was vetted and cleared by professionals. Whatever outdated record you dug up doesn't change the fact that families are living there now. This HOA will not entertain conspiracy theories." Greg slammed the papers onto the table in front of her. "This isn't a conspiracy, Janice. It's county records. If you're so confident, then explain why this man's name is still on the title." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then another resident, a woman named Evelyn Shaw, raised her hand. "I've lived here 15 years. My property backs up to that land. When they started construction, I thought it was strange that nobody posted ownership notices on the fence line. Don't developers usually do that? Janice's face flushed. Look, these are minor clerical oversights. Nothing more. Do you really think a multi-million-dollar project would move forward without the proper legal work? Please. But the certainty in her tone didn't land the way it used to. Doubt had a way of spreading, and now it was running through the room like wildfire. Outside the meeting, whispers grew loud. One homeowner said they'd spoken to a lawyer, who confirmed that if the land truly belonged to someone else, every single title in the new development could be void. Another worried aloud about mortgages. What would happen if their house wasn't legally theirs to own? Meanwhile, Calvin remained quiet. He didn't confront Janice publicly. He didn't attend the HOA meeting. But he heard about it the next day when Troy stopped by his house. They're starting to crack, Cal, Troy said, leaning against the portrail. Greg called you out by name. Folks are asking questions now. Calvin set down the newspaper he'd been reading. Good. Let Janice talk herself into a corner. The more she denies it, the worse she looks when the truth comes out. Troy chuckled. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Calvin, a small shake of his head. Enjoying? No. This is business, and business doesn't care about feelings. Back in her office, Janice was feeling the pressure. Emails from concerned homeowners filled her inbox. Investors were asking for reassurance. Even the developers were starting to question why the title transfer hadn't shown up on county records. One evening, she sat across from her vice president, Harold Flynn, a nervous man who had gone along with every one of her decisions up to this point. Janice, Harold whispered. What if they're right? What if this reading guy really does own the land? Janice slammed her pen down on the desk. Don't you dare say that to me. We've come too far. If we start doubting ourselves now, this whole project collapses. Do you want to be responsible for that? Harold swallowed hard. No, of course not. But the board is asking questions. They're scared. Then tell them what I tell you, Janice snapped. Everything is fine. This is paperwork, nothing more. But inside, Janice wasn't as confident as she sounded. She knew how dangerous a claim like Calvin's could be. And for the first time, the certainty she had paraded in front of cameras felt thin. Meanwhile, Calvin was sharpening his move. At Monica Trellion's office in Fort Worth, the lawyer spread out documents across her mahogany desk. They're cornered, she said, tapping the deed with her pen. The longer they wait to acknowledge this, the worse it gets for them. We'll give them just enough rope to tie themselves up. Then we'll file. Calvin leaned forward. So, we let them keep digging. Monica nodded. Exactly, because the deeper the hole, the harder they'll fall when the ground gives way. But just as the cracks were beginning to show in Janice's empire, Calvin and his lawyer were about to strike the first real blow. And once it landed, nothing in Briar Glen would be the same. The letter landed on Janice Mann's desk on a gray Tuesday morning in October. At first glance, it didn't look like much, just a thick white envelope, stamped with the name of a law office out of Fort Worth. But the moment she slid it open, and unfolded the papers inside, her stomach dropped. It was a formal notice of claim from Calvin Redden, asserting full ownership of the land where all 120 homes had been built. The language was blunt. It cited deed numbers, tax records, survey maps, and court filings going back decades. At the bottom was Monica Trellion's signature. The letter gave the HOA and developers 30 days to respond, warning that failure to comply would result in immediate litigation. Janice read it twice, then shoved it aside like it was toxic. No, she muttered, pacing her office. This is nonsense. This can't hold up. But the panic in her eyes betrayed her words. That afternoon she called an emergency meeting with the HOA board and the developers. They gathered around a long oak table in the back of the Briar Glen clubhouse. Janice, usually poised and commanding, looked rattled. She slapped the letter onto the table. This, she said, her voice sharp, is an attempt at extortion. Harold Flynn, her vice president, picked up the document and adjusted his glasses. His face piled as he scanned it. Janice, this isn't just a letter. This is airtight. If these records are real, then we built everything on the wrong man's land. A developer, a tall man named Robert Engel, leaned forward, his voice low, but menacing. Do you have any idea what kind of liability this exposes us to? Buyers could sue. Banks could pull funding. Insurance won't cover a damn thing. You told us this land was clear. Janice bristled. It was clear. We vetted it. This guy is just trying to cash in. Harold slid the letter back across the table. Janice, he has the original deed. It's registered with the county. That's not something you can fake. The room fell into a tense silence. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. Finally, Robert Engel slammed his fist onto the table. If this is true, We're sitting on a $40 million disaster. And you, he pointed directly at Janice, are the one who sold us on it. For the first time, Janice felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Across town, Calvin was calm. Sitting in Monica's office, he listened as she explained the next steps. Once the claim is public, it's like pulling the pin on a grenade. Every homeowner, every bank, every contractor, they'll all know. Some will panic, some will deny it, but the truth won't change. Calvin sipped his coffee, his expression steady. Good. They need to know. My family's been ignored long enough. 2 days later, the news broke. Local television ran the headline: Briar Glen homes, built on disputed land, ownership in question. Reporters camped outside the subdivision, filming residents as they came and went. Some homeowners refused to speak, others vented their fury. One resident, Dana Ortiz, the nurse who had walked her boys through the model home, stood on her porch, tears in her eyes as she spoke to a reporter. I put everything I had into this house. My kids thought this was our future, and now you're telling me it might not even be ours. How could the HOA let this happen? The story exploded online. Social media lit up with arguments about HOAs, greed and property rights. Some people called Calvin a hero for standing his ground. Others painted him as a villain for threatening family's home. Calvin didn't respond to the noise. He let Monica handle the press, while he kept his focus on the case. At another emergency HOA meeting, the anger reached a boiling point. The room was packed wall to wall with homeowners shouting over each other. A man in the back yelled, "You sold us worthless property." Another shouted, "Are we supposed to just walk away from our homes?" Janice banged her gavel furiously. "Everyone, calm down. We are working on this. Working on it." Greg Simmons cut her off. Standing in the aisle, "You lied to us. You told us the land was cleared. You told us we had nothing to worry about. And now every single one of us could lose everything." The crowd erupted, voices rising into chaos. Meanwhile, Calvin sat quietly in his truck just outside the development, watching the commotion unfold. Denise sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They're scared," she said softly. "They should be," Calvin answered. "When you build on lies, fear's the first payment due." Denise glanced at him, worry in her eye. "They're going to come after you now," Calvin exhaled, watching the lights in the community center flicker against the night sky. "Let them. I've been ready for this fight since the day they broke ground." But the letter was only the beginning, because what came next would turn Briar Glen from a quiet suburb into a battlefield of lawsuits, anger and betrayal. By November, Briar Glen no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like a war zone made of words, papers and anger. The streets were lined with for sale signs that nobody wanted to buy. Realtors stopped showing houses. Contractors refused to finish the last 20 units because the banks froze their financing. And in the middle of it all, the homeowners who had already moved in felt like their lives were collapsing. Inside the community center, meetings turned into shouting matches. Families carried their children in tow, babies crying as their parents screamed at the HOA board. On one bitterly cold evening, Dana Ortiz stood up, her voice cracking as she spoke to the room. "I've been a nurse for 15 years. I've worked double shifts, weekends, holidays, all to save for a place my boys could finally call home. And now you're telling me we might not even own it, that this man could take it from us overnight." She turned sharply toward Janice. "How could you let this happen?" Janice gripped the table so tightly, her knuckles went white. "Mrs. Ortiz, no one is taking your home. These claims are exaggerated. The lawyers are sorting it out." "It out?" a man shouted from the back. "We're paying mortgages on houses that might not even exist on paper. You lied to us." The room erupted in chants. "You lied. You lied." Harold Flynn, pale and sweating, whispered to Janice, "We can't hold this crowd much longer." Janice slammed the gavel, her voice shrill. "Enough. I will not let hysteria dictate this community. The HOA is in control, and we will protect your property." But her words sounded hollow and the crowd knew it. Outside the meetings, the chaos spilled onto the streets. One night, a group of homeowners confronted a realtor who had sold them their house. "You said everything was legit," one man shouted, grabbing the realtor's. The realtor pulled away, sweating under the porch light. "That's what we were told. Don't blame me. Blame the HOA." Meanwhile, Calvin kept his distance. He didn't attend the meetings. He didn't argue with residents. He simply stayed in touch with Monica, who filed the official lawsuit in district court. The case named the HOA, the developers, and Janice personally. Damages, tens of millions of dollars. At home, Denise watched the news footage of angry homeowners storming out of meetings. She glanced at Calvin, who was calmly sipping tea. They're tearing each other apart out there, she said. They should be, Calvin replied. They bet their lives on Janice's word. Now they know what her word is worth. But do you ever feel sorry for them? Denise asked. They're losing homes. Calvin's gaze was steady. My grandfather nearly lost his land to tricks, just like this. Nobody felt sorry for him. He fought and he won. Now it's my turn. The law doesn't play favorites. It only cares about paper. Back in the subdivision, tension built with every passing day. Children stopped playing outside. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other. Some blamed Janice. Others blamed Calvin. And a few blamed both. What united them was fear. Fear that everything they'd worked for was slipping away. Janice, however, refused to accept defeat. At a private meeting with developers, she paced the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood. We need to fight this, she said, her voice sharp. Challenge his deed. Discredit his claim. Whatever it takes. Robert Engel, the developer, threw up his hand. Janice, the man has 70 years of clean paperwork. There's nothing to fight. If we go to court, we lose. And when we lose, it'll bankrupt us all. Janice's face hardened. I won't let that happen. I built this. I will not watch it fall because of some man with a piece of paper. Robert's voice dropped low and furious. You didn't build this. You gambled with other people's money and other people's lives. And now the bills come due. Janice turned away, blinking fast to hide the tears burning her eyes. She couldn't admit it. Not to Robert, not to Harold, not to anyone. But deep inside she knew the truth. The empire she had built was crumbling. That same week, Calvin attended the first hearing at the courthouse in Fort Worth. He walked in quietly, dressed in a clean suit that Denise had ironed the night before. Reporters snapped photos as he entered. But Calvin didn't say a word. Inside the courtroom, he sat beside Monica, calm and collected, while Janice and her legal team scrambled with folders and laptops. As the judge entered the room, Monica leaned toward Calvin and whispered, "This is where it begins." But what started in that courtroom wasn't just a legal battle. It was the moment Briar Glen's chaos spilled into the public eye, and the whole country was about to watch. The courthouse in downtown Fort Worth was packed tighter than a Friday night football game. Reporters lined the hallways, cameras flashing every time someone walked through the double doors. For months, whispers about Briar Glen had swirled across the county, but now it was official. The dispute had landed in court. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Homeowners filled the gallery, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Some clutched folders of mortgage documents, as if the sight of their payments could somehow protect their home. On one side sat Calvin Redden, calm and composed, his hands folded on the table. Next to him, attorney Monica Trellian organized her notes with surgical precision. Across the aisle sat Janice Mand and the developers, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers, who looked more nervous than confident. The judge, a broad-shouldered man with a growly voice, opened the proceedings. This case will determine ownership of the land, known as the Gables at Briar Glen, and the validity of all subsequent property sales. Let's proceed. Monica stood first. She didn't waste time with theatrics. Holding up a yellowed sheet of paper, she said, "Your Honor, this is the original deed from 1953, purchased by Theodore Redden, passed down to his son, then to my client, Mr. Calvin Redden. It has never been transferred, never been sold, and all taxes have been paid in full. We will provide supporting evidence from county records, tax receipts, and survey maps." She laid the document carefully on the judge's bench. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then it was the defense's turn. One of Janice's lawyers, a slick man in a tailored gray suit, rose to speak. "Your Honor, while the deed may be valid, the reality is that this land has been developed in good faith. The HOA, the developers, and the homeowners acted under the assumption that the property was available. To reverse ownership now would cause irreparable harm to hundreds of families." The judge leaned forward. "Counsel, are you acknowledging that the plaintiff is the rightful owner?" The lawyer hesitated, tugging at his collar. "We acknowledge that the records are complicated. However, the development has already been completed, and the cost of undoing it would be catastrophic." From the gallery, a homeowner shouted, "Catastrophic for us, you mean?" The bailiff banged his gavel, restoring order. Monica seized the moment. "Your Honor, the defendants claim good faith, but good faith doesn't excuse negligence. They had every opportunity to verify ownership before building. They didn't. They gambled, and they gambled on my client's land. That's not an accident. That's arrogance." Calvin sat quietly, his face unreadable, but inside he felt the weight of generations pressing behind him. This wasn't just his fight. It was his grandfather's, his father. It was every black family that had lost land to paperwork tricks, and broken promises. When it was Janice's turn to testify, the courtroom leaned in. She walked stiffly to the witness stand. Her usual confidence dimmed. Monica began the questioning. Miss Mand, did you personally review the deed before authorizing development? Janice's lips tightened. I relied on the information provided by our consultants. So you didn't review it yourself? I trusted the experts. Monica paced slowly. And when residents raised concerns about ownership, what was your response? Janice's eyes flicked toward the gallery, then back to Monica. I told them the matter had been vetted. Monica's voice sharpened. Even though you had not personally verified it. Janice bristled. That's how leadership works. You trust your team. Monica leaned in. Or you ignore the truth when it threatens your ambition. The judge rapped his gavel as murmurs filled the room. During cross-examination, Janice's own lawyers tried to cast Calvin as opportunistic, someone waiting in the shadows for others to make an expensive mistake. Monica cut that argument down with calm precision. Opportunistic? My client didn't move the bulldozers. He didn't pour the foundation. He simply owned the land they trespassed on. To call him opportunistic is to punish him for protecting what was his all along. The gallery erupted in applause until the bailiff shouted for silence. By the end of the day, the direction of the case was clear. Calvin's side had the paper, the history, the law. Janice's side had excuses and fear. As court adjourned, Janice walked briskly past reporters, ignoring their questions. But one camera caught the flash of panic in her eyes. Meanwhile, Calvin stepped outside into the sunlight. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. Mr. Reen, what do you say to the families who fear losing their homes? Calvin paused, his voice steady. I don't want to see families hurt. But my family's land was stolen on paper, before anyone poured a drop of concrete. What would you do if it was your grandfather's legacy they built on without asking? The clip aired that night and it struck a chord across the country. Online, debates exploded. Some praised Calvin for standing up to corruption. Others accused him of destroying innocent families' future. But no one could deny the facts. The land was his, but while the courtroom gave Calvin the upper hand, the fallout outside those walls was growing into a storm neither side could control. By the time the first round of hearings wrapped up, Briar Glen had turned into a community living in limbo. Homeowners woke up every day not knowing if the house they slept in legally belonged to them. Mortgage companies began sending letters demanding clarification on the titles, and some even threatened foreclosure if the legal chaos wasn't resolved. At night, porch lights flickered on across the subdivision. But the usual warmth of a neighborhood was gone. No more block parties, no more kids running door to door, selling cookies for school fundraisers. Instead, neighbors glared at each other, whispered, or avoided eye contact altogether. Everyone was looking for someone to blame. For many, that blame fell squarely on Janice Mand. She couldn't go to the grocery store without hearing hushed insults. At a gas station one morning, a woman shouted across the pumps, "You ruined our lives, Jan." Janice turned away, clutching her keys, pretending not to hear. The once confident HOA president now moved through town like a ghost. Her tailored blazers swapped for oversized sunglasses and quick exits. Inside her home, the pressure was unbearable. Harold Flynn, her vice president, had already resigned, citing health reasons, but everyone knew he just didn't want his name dragged deeper into the scandal. The developer stopped returning her calls. Even her own neighbors began circulating a petition to remove her from the HOA presidency. One night, she sat at her dining table with papers spread across the surface, legal filings, angry letters from homeowners, foreclosure warnings. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed Robert Engel, the lead developer. "Robert, we need to fight this harder," she pleaded. When he answered, "We can't just roll over. There has to be a loophole, some technicality." Robert cut her off. His voice was cold. "Janice, there is no loophole. We built on land we didn't own. That's the end of the story. My company is negotiating settlements. You're on your own." The line went dead. Meanwhile, Calvin's world was calmer, but not untouched. He and Denise still lived in their modest home, but now their phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, activists asking him to speak at conferences, lawyers offering partnerships. Calvin declined most of it. He wasn't chasing attention, he was chasing justice. Still, the weight of the community's anger found its way to him. One evening, as he walked into a grocery store, a man stopped him near the entrance. "You're the reason my sister might lose her house," the man hissed. "You could have stopped this before it started." Calvin held the man's gaze, his voice calm. "Your sister didn't lose her house because of me. She lost it because the people you trusted never checked the truth." The man shook his head and walked away, but the sting of his words lingered. At home that night, Denise asked softly, "Do you ever wonder if it's worth all this anger, Cal?" He sighed,
setting down his coffee. Worth it? Yes. Easy? No. But if I back down, then it tells every HOA, every developer that they can trample whoever they want and get away with it. Somebody has to draw the line. In December, the judge issued his ruling. The land legally belonged to Calvin. The HOA had no authority to sell or develop it, and the developers had acted without proper clearance. Every home in the Gables at Briar Glen was declared invalid property, pending resolution of damages. The ruling sent shockwaves across Texas. News outlets covered it as one of the largest HOA scandals in recent memory. Talk shows debated whether Calvin was a defender of property rights or a destroyer of communities. Hashtags trended online. The whole country seemed to have an opinion about Briar Glen. For the homeowners, the ruling was devastating. Families wept in their kitchens. Children asked parents if they had to move again. Some tried to band together, organizing petitions to beg Calvin for leniency. Others directed all their fury at Janice, calling for her. Janice herself faced lawsuits not just from Calvin, but from the very homeowners she had once promised to protect. Her reputation was in shambles, her finances collapsing under legal fees, and the legacy she had tried to build was nothing but ashes. For Calvin, the victory was bittersweet. He had won, yes, but he also saw the human cost. Families who had been sold a dream were now paying the price of someone else's arrogance. Sitting on his porch one evening, he watched the glow of Briar Glen in the distance. Denise came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside him. "You did what you had to," she said. Calvin nodded slowly. "I know, but it shouldn't have come to this. They could have asked, they could have checked, they didn't. And now everyone paid." But even as the judge's ruling settled the matter on paper, the story of Briar Glen wasn't over, because the lesson it carried was just as heavy as the land it was built on. The winter after the ruling, Briar Glen sat in a strange silence. The holiday lights that usually sparkled on rooftops were missing. Families kept to themselves, too drained by courtierings and financial uncertainty to celebrate. For those who had bought into the Gables, the dream of homeownership had curdled into anxiety and fear. Boxes that had just been unpacked were being taped shut again. Conversations once filled with hope now revolved around lawyers, banks, and what happens next. Janice Mand, once the proud face of Briar Glen, was now a pariah. Her mailbox overflowed with lawsuits. She could barely leave her house without hearing the word liar whispered as she passed. When she looked in the mirror, she saw the cost of her ambition. Sleepless eyes, hair falling out from stress, hands that trembled when she signed yet another legal notice. She had chased legacy, but left behind nothing but broken trust. For Calvin Reen, the outcome was clear, but heavy. He had protected his family's land, just as his grandfather and father would have wanted. The law had spoken, affirming what he always knew, that the deed mattered more than glossy brochures or political speeches. But as he drove through the half-finished neighborhood, he couldn't ignore the human toll. Children rode their bikes in driveways that might not belong to their parents. Couples sat on porches, staring at the horizon, wondering if they'd have to move again. One afternoon, Donna Ortiz stopped him outside the courthouse. She wasn't angry, she was exhausted. "Mr. Reen," she said quietly, her voice breaking, "I don't blame you, I blame her." She glanced bitterly toward Janice's car parked across the street. "But please tell me, do we have to lose everything?" Calvin's expression softened. "I can't answer for the banks, ma'am. I can only answer for my land. I didn't take it from you, I just kept it from being taken from me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I worked my whole life for that house." Calvin looked away for a moment before replying. "So did my grandfather. For this land, that's why we're both standing here fighting for something we love." That exchange made its way into local papers, and people began to see the story differently. It wasn't just about winners and losers, it was about choices, about how one woman's pride and shortcuts had spiraled into suffering for everyone around her. By January, demolition crews began taking down the last unfinished houses. The developers agreed to partial settlements. Some families were bought out by banks, and others remained in limbo, trapped in homes they couldn't legally claim. Calvin was awarded damages and full recognition of his ownership, but he refused to gloat. He stayed in his modest home, keeping the same quiet life he always had, never flashing the wealth he had gained from the settlements. In interviews, Calvin always said the same thing. This was never about money, it was about respect. Respect for the law, respect for history, and respect for what belongs to you. The story of Briar Glen spread far beyond Texas. Newspapers across the country ran features about the man who waited, using Calvin as an example of patience and foresight, where suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Boards forced to double-check every property record before moving forward with projects. The case became a warning taught in real estate seminars. Verify ownership or risk everything. For Janice, the fall was total. She resigned from the HOA, her once polished reputation permanently shattered. Investors she had once dined with wouldn't take her call. Even old friends kept their distance. Alone in her kitchen one night she whispered to herself, "I thought I was building a future, but all I built was a lie." The moral was clear: pride without caution leads to destruction. Ambition without respect for the basics, like truth and ownership, can ruin not just one person, but entire families, entire communities. In the end, Calvin's long game wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about honoring the sacrifices of those who came before him. And in that way, the story of Briar Glen wasn't just about homes and land. It was about the cost of arrogance and the value of patience. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: shortcuts and arrogance might win you applause in the moment, but the truth always catches up. And when it does, it doesn't just bring you down, it brings down everyone who believed in you. Respect the law, respect what doesn't belong to you, and never build your future on a foundation you don't truly own. And if you want more stories that cut to the heart of power, mistakes, and the lessons we can all learn, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because stories like these don't just entertain, they remind us how fragile trust really is.